this video, I'll be going over relative clauses and adverbial clauses. So as a review, subordinate clauses occur when a clause takes the place of a noun phrase, an adjective phrase, or an adverb phrase. When a clause is functioning as a noun phrase, it's a complement clause. A relative clause functions as an adjective phrase, and an adverbial clause functions as an adverb phrase. Complement clauses function as arguments of verbs, meaning they cannot be removed from the sentence without making the sentence ungrammatical. And relative and adverbial clauses are adjuncts, meaning they aren't functioning as arguments of verbs and they can be removed from the sentence. So an example would be, the student who studied all night passed the exam. Who studied all night is an adjunct, it's a relative clause, so you can remove it from the sentence and still be left with a grammatical sentence. The student passed the exam. Same with adverbial clauses, like in the example, the phone didn't ring because it was on silent mode. Because it was on silent mode is an adjunct, it's an adverbial clause, and we can remove it from the sentence and still have a grammatical sentence. The phone didn't ring. So relative clauses, again, modify nouns and function as adjectives. They're adjuncts and can be removed from the sentence, and they may begin with a relative pronoun, which can be that or a WH word. So in the sentence, the dog that barked was a collie, the relative clause is that barked, and that is the relative pronoun. In the sentence, the student who is singing right now is my son, the relative clause is who is singing right now, and the relative pronoun is who. And the relative pronoun is optional in certain types of relative clauses. So in the sentence, the reason that she left is unclear, you can omit the relative pronoun that and still have a grammatical sentence. The reason she left is unclear. Relative clauses can be categorized by what the relative clause modifies and whether the relative pronoun is the subject or object of the relative clause. So that gives us 4 types. We have SS, which stands for subject-subject, and that means that the relative clause is modifying the subject of the sentence, and the relative pronoun is the subject of the relative clause. So in the example, the aliens who landed on Earth have pointy ears. The relative clause who landed on Earth is modifying the aliens, which is the subject of the sentence. And the relative pronoun who is the subject of the relative clause, who landed on Earth. In an SO relative clause or subject-object, an example would be, the humans who the aliens contacted were surprised. So the relative clause, who the aliens contacted, is modifying the subject of the sentence, which is the humans, and the relative pronoun who is the object of the relative clause. So the aliens in the relative clause, the aliens contacted, the aliens is the subject, and then who, which refers to the humans, is the object, or who was contacted. Then we have an OS, or object-subject relative clause, an example being, the aliens arrived in the ship that has warp drive. So, the relative clause that has warp drive is modifying the object of the sentence, the ship. And the relative pronoun that is functioning as the subject of the relative clause. That refers to the ship, which is the subject of the clause that has warp drive. And then finally, we have an OO, or object-object relative clause. And this means that the relative clause is modifying the object of the sentence. So we have, the ship was in the forest that the woman was camping in. So the relative clause that the woman was camping in is modifying forest, which is the object of the sentence. And the relative pronoun that is referring to forest, which is the object of the relative clause, because the subject of the relative clause is the woman. So you'll notice that in the second and fourth sentences, the relative pronoun is in parentheses because it's optional. So the rule is that when the relative pronoun is the object of the relative clause, you can omit it. So you could say, the humans the aliens contacted were surprised, and that's still grammatical to leave out the who. But when the relative clause, or when the relative pronoun is the subject of the relative clause, you can't omit it. So in the sentence, the aliens who landed on Earth have pointy ears, you can't omit that who and say, the aliens landed on Earth have pointy ears. That would be ungrammatical. All right, and then adverbial clauses can modify verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So an example for an adverbial clause that modifies a verb would be, I want the new book because it has pictures. Because it has pictures is an adverbial clause that's modifying the verb want. Another example would be, I saw the movie before my friend saw it. And the clause before my friend saw it is modifying the verb saw, right? Because it's saying when the seeing took place, right? And then in the first example, because it has pictures, is modifying the verb want and telling why the wanting is happening. An example of an adverbial clause modifying an adjective would be, she is better at math than I am. So the adverbial clause than I am is modifying the adjective better in the main clause. It's describing how much better she is. And then an example of an adverbial clause modifying an adverb would be, she is walking more quickly than you are. So the adverbial clause than you are is modifying the adverb quickly in the main clause. And it's describing how quickly. All right, so adverbial clauses usually begin with a subordinating conjunction. And this is a list of some of the common subordinating conjunctions in English. And there are a lot of them. Adverbial clauses can be categorized by the way in which they modify the verb. So we have temporal adverbial clauses, which describe when the action happened. And these would start with subordinating conjunctions like before, after, and when. So an example would be, after you eat lunch, you can go outside. The adverbial clause after you eat lunch is describing when the going, or the action in the sentence, would happen. Then we have causal adverbials, which describe the cause, or why the action happened. So I took a nap because I was tired. The adverbial clause would be because I was tired, and it's modifying or describing why the taking of a nap took place. We have conditional adverbials that begin with subordinating clauses like unless or if, and they place a condition on how the action can happen, or when or if the action can happen. So you can't play video games unless you finish your homework. Unless you finish your homework is the adverbial clause, and it's modifying how or when the playing can take place. And then we have concessional adverbials that start with subordinating clauses like although or while, and they place a concession on the action. So I'm going to read this although I may not finish it today. Although I may not finish it today is a concession on the action, which would be reading. Then we have comparative adverbials that would place a comparison on the action. So you're eating more than I am. Than I am would be in the adverbial clause, which is comparing it to the action of eating. And then we have adverbials of manner, which start with subordinating conjunctions like as if or like, which describes the manner in how the action is happening. So an example would be, she danced like nobody was watching. So the adverbial would be like nobody was watching, and that's describing the manner in which the dancing happened. All right, so this is a flowchart that can help you with identifying the type of subordinate clause. So we look at our clause and we decide if it's a complement or an adjunct. If it's a complement, we know it's a complement clause. And then from there you can decide which type of complement clause it is. If it contains an infinitive verb, it's an infinitive complement clause. If it starts with a WH word and doesn't contain an infinitive verb, it's a WH complement clause. And if it expresses a complete thought, it's a sentential complement clause. If the clause is an adjunct, then we decide if it's a relative clause or an adverbial clause by what it's modifying. If it's modifying a noun in the main clause, it's a relative clause. And if it's modifying a verb, an adverb, or an adjective, it's an adverbial clause. So your next two quizzes will be identifying relative and adverbial clauses. So some steps to keep in mind while you're going through these quizzes are, first, be sure and determine if the sentence is complex. So you need to count and make sure it has two or more main verbs. If it's not complex, then the answer is going to be false. Then you need to determine if the subordinate clause is a complement or an adjunct. If the clause is a complement, then it's going to be false because relative and adverbial clauses are always adjuncts. And then finally, you need to determine if the clause modifies a noun, which would be a relative clause, or if it modifies a verb, adjective, or adverb, which would be an adverbial clause. So we'll go through a few practice sentences. First, we'll do ones with relative clauses. So we're going to determine if each of these sentences contains a relative clause or not. The first sentence is, the very tall man from Germany is waiting over there. So first we need to determine if this sentence is complex. So we'll count our main verbs. So we have the auxiliary verb is, and then the main verb waiting, and that's it. There's only one main verb in this sentence. So this sentence is not complex, and the answer would then be false. It does not contain a relative clause. Our next sentence, my mother likes the car that has four-wheel drive. We have the main verb likes, and then we have the main verb has. So this contains two main verbs, so it is a complex sentence. And then we needed to determine what type of subordinate clause it is. So our subordinate clause in this sentence is that has four-wheel drive, and that clause is modifying car. It's saying what type of car it is. And because car is a noun, we can say yes, that has four-wheel drive is a relative clause. So this answer would be true. The sentence does contain a relative clause. Our third sentence, you should eat this sandwich when you get hungry. So we have our main verb eat, and then we have our main verb get. So we have two main verbs. This is a complex sentence. Our subordinate clause is when you get hungry. And when you get hungry is modifying the verb eat, right? It's not talking about what type of sandwich it is. It's talking about when the action of eating will take place. So we know since this is modifying a verb, it's an adverbial clause, and so our answer would be false. This sentence does not contain a relative clause. All right, and we'll do some practices for adverbial clauses as well. So we have three practice sentences. The first sentence, I watched this movie yesterday. So we'll count our main verbs. There's only one verb in this sentence, watched, so we know this sentence is not complex. It has an adverb, yesterday, but it doesn't have an adverbial clause, a whole second clause. So the answer to this would be false. This sentence does not contain an adverbial clause. Our next sentence, she's eating the sandwich that has extra mayo. So we have the main verb eating, and then we have the main verb has. Two main verbs, so this is a complex sentence. Our subordinate clause is that has extra mayo, and that is describing the sandwich, saying what type of sandwich it is. It's a sandwich with extra mayo. And because sandwich is a noun, we know that this is a relative clause. So this answer would be false. The sentence does not contain an adverbial clause. Our last sentence, she's eating dessert before she eats dinner. we have the main verb eating and the main verb eats. So we have two main verbs, so this is a complex sentence. Our subordinate clause is before she eats dinner. And before she eats dinner is modifying the verb, the first verb, eating, right? Because before she eats dinner isn't talking about the dessert, what type of dessert it is. And it's not modifying she, it's not saying what type of person she is. It's saying when she will eat the dessert, when she will do the eating. So because this is modifying a verb, the answer would be true. This does contain an adverbial clause. And that concludes our lectures on complex syntax.